Have you ever wondered what goes on behind closed doors? Secrets, lies, and the hidden truths that some people would do anything to keep buried. Well, today we're diving into one of the most shocking and twisted cases of betrayal and murder to ever hit the headlines, the story of Chris Watts.
County Communications, this is Stacey.
Hi, Stacey. My name's Nichol, and I'm calling because I'm concerned about a friend of mine. She's 15 weeks pregnant, and she wasn't feeling well over the weekend, and I have called and texted. I've come to her house. She's not answering the door. She's not responding to text messages, phone calls. I've had other friends reach out to her. None of us can get her to respond to us, and her car is here.
What's her name?
Shanann Watts.
And her husband's name is?
His name is Chris Watts. I just want to know if she's okay.
The story starts off like any other picturesque American family. Chris and Shanann Watts were living what appeared to be the dream life. A beautiful home in Frederick, Colorado, 2 adorable daughters, Bella and Celeste, and another baby on the way. To everyone who knew them, the Watts family seemed to have it all: perfect smiles, perfect photos on social media, and a future filled with promise. But beneath the surface, behind the closed doors of their suburban home, things were far from perfect. As Shanann's belly grew with their 3rd child, so too did the cracks in their marriage. The once happy couple now found themselves drifting apart, and Chris's behavior began to change in ways that no one could have anticipated. While Shanann traveled for work, Chris, the seemingly doting husband and father, was slipping into a dark, secret life, one that would soon have devastating consequences. By August of 2018, the facade was crumbling fast. Shanann had just returned home from a work trip when she and her 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, suddenly disappeared. At first, Chris played the part of the worried husband and father, pleading on local news channels for his family's safe return. But the truth was much darker. You see, Chris had been having an affair with a co-worker, a woman named Nichol Kessinger. What Shanann didn't know, and what Chris was desperate to keep hidden, was that he had been living a double life, one filled with lies, deceit, and a growing obsession with his new lover.
She came home from the airport 2 a.m. and I left around 5:15. She was still here. And like about 12:10 in that afternoon, her friend Nichol showed up at the door. Like, I had texted Shanann a few times that day, called her, say, but she never got back to me, but she wasn't getting back to any of her people as well.
But it wasn't just the affair that was the problem. Chris wanted out of his marriage, out of his responsibilities as a father, and he was willing to do the unthinkable to get there. The investigation into Shanann and her daughter's disappearance quickly intensified. Friends, family, and neighbors were desperate for answers. Why would a pregnant mother and her 2 little girls suddenly vanish without a trace? Police began to dig deeper into Chris's story, and the more they dug, the more suspicious they became. His calm demeanor and lack of emotion set off alarm bells. The timeline didn't add up. His story didn't add up. Then came the breaking point. When confronted with the mounting evidence against him, his cell phone records, his strange behavior, and the fact that he had failed a lie detector test, Chris's cool exterior finally cracked. And what he confessed was beyond anyone's darkest imaginations. Chris Watts didn't just snap. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. No, Chris had coldly and methodically planned the murders of his entire family. He strangled Shanann in their own bed while their daughters slept just down the hall. Then, he drove their lifeless bodies, along with his 2 terrified daughters, to an oil field where he worked. What came next is something that will haunt anyone who hears it. Bella and Celeste watched as their father wrapped their mother's body in a sheet and stuffed her into a shallow grave. Then, he turned on his own children. First, Celeste, his youngest, and when Bella, his eldest daughter, watched in horror and pleaded for her life, "Daddy, no," were her last words before he ended her life too. Chris dumped their bodies in oil tanks, disposing of his daughters like they were nothing more than garbage. His actions were calculated, emotionless, and utterly monstrous. And what for? To be with another woman? To avoid the responsibilities of fatherhood? The motives behind Chris's actions still leave many shaking their heads in disbelief. But one thing became clear: Chris Watts was no longer the mild-mannered, soft-spoken husband and father that his neighbors thought he was. He was a killer, hiding behind a mask of normalcy. As the trial approached, the gruesome details of Chris's crime came to light. The prosecution painted a chilling portrait of a man willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to escape a life he no longer wanted. They presented damning evidence: the GPS data from Chris's truck, the The surveillance footage of him leaving the house in the early hours of the morning, and the texts between him and Nichol, showing just how far gone he was. But in a shocking twist, Chris pled guilty to the murders, avoiding a lengthy trial. And while his guilty plea spared him from the death penalty, it did nothing to spare the agony of Shanann's family, who were left to pick up the pieces after the brutal loss of their daughter, their grandchildren, and their unborn grandson. Chris Watts is now serving 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, a fitting punishment for a man who tore apart not just one family, but an entire community. But the question that lingers for many is, how could this happen? How could a seemingly normal man commit such horrific acts? Was it his affair, his desire for a new life, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface all along? One thing is for certain: the Watts family tragedy serves as a grim reminder that not everything is as it seems. Behind the smiles, behind the closed doors, secrets can fester, and sometimes those secrets can kill. The aftermath of the murders left a gaping wound in the town of Frederick, Colorado. Shanann's family, the Rozucheks, were devastated. Not only had they lost their daughter, but their granddaughters and unborn grandson as well. The community mourned the loss of the Watts family, but the pain ran deeper for those closest to them. The question of why haunted them, as they struggled to come to terms with the unimaginable. Chris Watts' behavior during the investigation became a focal point of the case. The surveillance footage from his neighbor's home revealed Chris backing his truck into the garage early in the morning and loading what appeared to be large objects. This was the moment he was preparing to dispose of his wife and daughters, and this footage was critical in unraveling his web of lies. As more details emerged, it became clear just how far Chris had fallen. His affair with Nichol Kessinger, which he had tried to keep hidden, was at the heart of his motivation. Nichol, who initially cooperated with investigators, claimed she had no idea Chris was still married. She believed he was in the process of separating from Shanann and was unaware of the depth of his deception until after the murders. Text messages between Chris and Nichol painted a different picture: a man desperate to start a new life, free from the responsibilities of family. But the most disturbing revelations came from Chris himself, during his final confession. In a chilling interview from prison, Chris admitted to everything. He described how he killed Shanann after an argument about their future. He claimed that Shanann confronted him about the affair, and in a fit of rage, he strangled her. But what came next was even more disturbing. Chris admitted that he did not spare his daughters in the aftermath of Shanann's death. Instead, he made the horrifying decision to take their lives as well. Chris's confession was gut-wrenching, not only for the details of the crime but for the coldness with which he recounted it. He showed little emotion as he described how he smothered his daughters, how Bella had fought back, and how Celeste had been too young to understand what was happening. The horror of those final moments was incomprehensible, and it left many wondering how a father could do such a thing to his own children. The case quickly became a media spectacle, with news outlets from around the world covering every detail. True crime enthusiasts analyzed every aspect of the case, from Chris's psychology to the timeline of events leading up to the murders. Documentaries were made, podcasts dissected the evidence, and social media buzzed with theories about what really drove Chris to commit such heinous acts. But as much as the public was fascinated by the case, for those involved, it was a nightmare they couldn't escape. Nichol Kessinger, though not implicated in the murders, was vilified by the public. Many saw her as the catalyst for Chris's actions, despite her claims of ignorance about his marriage. She eventually went into hiding, changing her name and attempting to disappear from public life, but the stigma of her connection to the case followed her. For Shanann's family, the Rozucheks, the pain was unbearable. They had lost everything: their daughter, their grandchildren, and their future with them. At the sentencing hearing, Shanann's father, Frank Rozuch, gave an emotional statement, addressing Chris directly. "You heartlessly took away my whole family," he said. "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. And they trusted you. The only thing that matters to me now is justice for them." Shanann's brother, Frankie, also spoke, expressing his disbelief and anger at what Chris had done. He described how Chris had not only betrayed their family but had destroyed lives in the most brutal way possible. The Rozucheks called for Chris to receive the maximum sentence, and the judge granted their wish. Chris Watts will never see the outside of a prison again. He is currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a fate that many believe is not punishment enough for the horror he inflicted on his family. In his quiet, solitary cell, Chris is left to reflect on the choices he made, the lies, the betrayal, and the unimaginable cruelty of his actions. Even now, years later, the Chris Watts case remains a chilling reminder of how far a person can fall. The man who once seemed like the perfect husband and father turned out to be hiding a darkness that no one could have anticipated. And for those left behind, the scars of that fateful night will never fully heal. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico were taken too soon, victims of a man who put his own selfish desires above the lives of his family. Their memory, however, lives on in the hearts of those who loved them, and their tragic story serves as a stark warning of the dangers of unchecked lies, secrets, and betrayal. As the months turned into years, the Watts family murders evolved from a chilling news story into a permanent scar on the fabric of American true crime history. Chris Watts, once the image of a loving father and husband, became infamous as the man who annihilated his entire family, leaving behind a nation grappling with how such evil could emerge from someone who appeared so ordinary. Shanann Watts, a vibrant woman full of life, became the heart-wrenching symbol of trust betrayed in the worst possible way. She had shared so much of her life on social media, pictures of happy moments, posts about love, her pregnancy with their son, and the life she was building with Chris and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste. But none of those photos, none of the happy captions, could have foretold the horrific end that awaited her and her children. What haunted people the most wasn't just the brutality of the murders, but the fact that Chris Watts had been living a double life. It wasn't just the affair with Nichol Kessinger, though that alone was damning. It was the way he had coldly and methodically planned the destruction of his family. While outwardly playing the role of the loving father, Chris had been quietly crafting an escape from his responsibilities. The Watts home, which should have been a place of safety and love, had become a breeding ground for deceit, lies, and ultimately murder. Chris's affair with Nichol Kessinger wasn't a casual fling, it was the catalyst for the murders. From the outside, Chris appeared like any other family man, but behind closed doors, he was preparing to abandon his life with Shanann and their children, chasing a fantasy future with Nichol. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about power and control. In Chris's mind, killing his family was the only way to escape the life he no longer wanted. The investigation into Chris's actions revealed a man who was far more calculating than anyone had imagined. As authorities delved deeper into his behavior in the days leading up to the murders, a terrifying picture began to emerge. He had been searching online for information about divorce settlements and child custody, suggesting that he had, at one point, considered a more legal route to ending his marriage. But something changed. At some point, Chris made the horrifying decision that divorce wasn't enough. He wanted his wife and children gone, permanently. In the weeks before the murders, Shanann had begun to suspect that something was wrong. Text messages between Shanann and her friends revealed her growing unease about Chris's distant behavior. He had become cold, detached, and uninterested in their marriage. She confided in her friends that she feared Chris no longer loved her, that something had shifted between them. Little did she know just how deep those changes ran, or how dangerous Chris had become. On August 13, 2018, the world changed for Shanann Watts and her two daughters. After returning from a work trip, Shanann likely had no idea that her husband was already planning her death. Chris's actions that night were not a crime of passion, they were cold, calculated, and premeditated. And he killed Shanann in their bedroom, smothering her in their bed while she was likely unaware of the monstrous thoughts running through his mind. What makes this story even more tragic, if that's even possible, is what came next. After killing Shanann, Chris went to his daughters' rooms. Bella and Celeste, just 4 and 3 years old, were still alive, unaware that their mother was dead and that they were about to suffer the same fate. Chris loaded his wife's body into his truck, then placed his two daughters in the back seat with her lifeless body. It's a detail so horrifying, it's difficult to even imagine. As Chris drove to a remote oil field where he worked, Bella and Celeste must have been confused, maybe even frightened. But Chris showed no mercy. Once they arrived at the oil site, Chris did the unthinkable. He smothered both of his daughters, one after the other, before disposing of their tiny bodies in separate oil tanks. The level of cruelty Chris displayed that day defies understanding. How could a father, someone meant to protect and love his children, commit such an atrocity? And how could he do it with such calm and calculated precision? For investigators and the public alike, it was a question that had no clear answer. As Chris Watts's lies began to unravel, it became clear that he had never intended to get away with the perfect crime. His stories were inconsistent, and his behavior grew more erratic. From the moment he reported Shanann and the girls missing, something about his demeanor didn't sit right with those closest to him. He was too calm, too composed, and when police brought him in for questioning, it didn't take long for his carefully constructed facade to crack. At first, Chris claimed that he had no idea where Shanann and the girls were, suggesting that maybe she had taken the kids and left in the middle of the night. But when the surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed Chris loading something into his truck in the early hours of the morning, the walls began to close in on him. Investigators pressed harder, and Chris eventually broke. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he concocted a story that Shanann had killed the girls, and that he, in a fit of rage, had killed her in retaliation. It was a story so absurd that even the investigators could hardly believe he was trying to pass it off as the truth. But it didn't matter, Chris had already sealed his fate. The forensic evidence, combined with Chris's confession, painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned the deaths of his family, all for the sake of starting a new life with his mistress. But what about Nichol Kessinger, the woman Chris had risked everything for? Her involvement in the case became a subject of endless debate. While she maintained that she knew nothing of Chris's plans and only found out about the murders after they had happened, some people weren't convinced. Could she really have been that oblivious? Or had she turned a blind eye to the warning signs? Public opinion was harsh. Nichol's life was forever changed by her association with Chris Watts. She went into hiding, changed her name, and tried to disappear from the public eye. But the shadow of the Watts case followed her wherever she went, a reminder that sometimes being close to a monster can ruin more than just one life. For the families of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico, the loss was immeasurable. The Razusek family, Shanann's parents, dedicated themselves to preserving her memory and raising awareness about domestic violence. They were thrust into a nightmare they couldn't wake from, forced to relive the horror of their daughter and grandchildren's deaths every time Chris's name came up in the media. And what of Chris Watts? His trial was brief, as he eventually pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that many believed was too lenient for the horrors he committed. Now, Chris spends his days in a maximum security prison, far from the life he once lived. He is haunted by the memory of what he did, forever branded as one of the most cold-blooded killers in modern American history. As Chris Watts languished in prison, the world outside continued to grapple with the aftermath of his actions. The Watts family murders had become a symbol of the hidden dangers that could lurk within any home, within any seemingly perfect family. Chris, now a man stripped of everything, his freedom, his family, and even his humanity, was left with only the haunting memories of what he had done. Behind bars, Chris attempted to navigate a new reality where his infamy preceded him. Other inmates viewed him with a mix of disdain and fascination. To them, he wasn't just another convict, he was the man who killed his own children, a crime so heinous that even hardened criminals found it difficult to comprehend. Isolated in his cell, Chris had nothing but time to reflect on the choices he had made, the lives he had destroyed, and the fact that he would never again walk free. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the world moved on, but not without leaving scars. The story of Chris Watts was still fresh in the minds of the public. True crime enthusiasts continued to pore over every detail of the case, trying to piece together the why behind such unimaginable evil. Documentaries were made, podcasts dissected the timeline, and discussions about domestic violence and mental health gained new urgency. For Shanann Watts's family, the pain of losing their daughter and grandchildren never dulled. Each day was a battle against the overwhelming grief that consumed them. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razusek, became vocal advocates for victims of domestic abuse, using their platform to educate others about the warning signs of a controlling and abusive partner, something Shanann had likely begun to recognize too late. The legacy of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico became one of both tragedy and resilience. Shanann's social media presence, which once documented the joy and love she had for her family, became a heartbreaking archive of a life cut too short. But for her parents, those posts served as a reminder of who Shanann really was: a loving mother, a devoted wife, and someone who was full of hope for the future. They worked tirelessly to ensure that their daughter's memory wasn't overshadowed by the horror of her death. The Watts case, however, wasn't just about one family's tragedy. It opened up a broader conversation about the masks people wear and the hidden lives they lead. Chris Watts wasn't the only man hiding a dark secret behind the facade of a perfect life. His actions forced many to confront the uncomfortable reality that even the people closest to us can harbor dangerous secrets. Criminologists, psychologists, and legal experts examined the case from every angle. What led Chris Watts to commit such an unthinkable act? Was it a combination of factors: financial stress, the pressure of his affair, and the impending arrival of a third child? Or was it something deeper, something that had been festering inside him long before he ever met Nichol Kessinger? Many pointed to Chris's need for control as a key factor. He couldn't control his marriage, his finances, or his life, so he sought control in the most extreme way possible by eliminating the very people he was supposed to protect. Nichol Kessinger's role in the case continued to be a point of contention. While there was no evidence to suggest she had any involvement in the murders, public opinion wasn't so forgiving. To many, she was the woman who had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, triggered the chain of events that led to the deaths of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Her name became synonymous with scandal and infamy, and despite her efforts to escape the spotlight, she would never fully rid herself of her connection to Chris Watts. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case was the fact that Chris showed no outward signs of violence or instability before the murders. He wasn't someone who had a history of abusive behavior or a criminal record. He was, by all appearances, an average man living an average life. And that's what made his crimes all the more terrifying: the idea that anyone, no matter how ordinary they seemed, could be capable of such profound evil. As the years passed, Chris Watts's story faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, and new crimes. But for the families involved, the pain remained as fresh as ever. Shanann's family, while grateful for the justice that had been served, knew that no prison sentence could ever bring back their loved ones. The hole left in their lives by Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico could never be filled. For Chris, life behind bars was a far cry from the future he had envisioned with Nichol Kessinger. In the end, his desperate bid for control had left him with nothing. He had traded his family, his freedom, and his very soul for a fleeting fantasy of a new life, only to find himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The Chris Watts case serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always present itself in the ways we expect. Sometimes it hides behind the most unsuspecting faces, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And when it does, the devastation it leaves in its wake can be unimaginable. In the end, Chris Watts became the embodiment of betrayal, cruelty, and deception, a man who will be remembered not for the life he lived, but for the lives he took. His story will forever be a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind the mask of a seemingly perfect life. And for those left behind, the memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico will continue to serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked evil.